Thanks, everybody.
2, 1.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to New Networks for Nature. This is a session originally intended for our conference in York last November. My name is Jamie, and I would have originally been hosting the session in person. We're really pleased that our guests were willing to try this new experiment with us and go online via a live YouTube broadcast tonight that will last 1 hour. The idea of the session was Northern Revival, also known as Northern Wilding, of which more later. But all I'd like to say initially is that there's obviously a function on YouTube that you can use for questions and chat if you happen to be registered there. Amy Jane Beer from New Networks for Nature, one of the volunteers alongside me, will be helping to monitor that and helping us to link in with others. The whole reason New Networks for Nature exists is to help people speak to each other, so please feel free to use the chat function. This is not seen as a one-way process, a lecture, a classroom session, or anything of that description, really. It's a conversation, and hopefully it will spark further conversations and thoughts and questions. My name's Jamie. I've not really explained my role here beyond being a volunteer for New Networks for Nature. I've worked in conservation in Cumbria now for about 12 or 13 years. It's the longest time I've ever held a job for, and that's largely because I get to meet people like the people we've got with us tonight. Different experiences, different interests, different expertise. It's certainly been fuel for my brain and my soul and my heart, and kept me engaged in living, to be quite honest, working in conservation. And I've really enjoyed being based in the north, having lived all over the country so far. I feel very fond of where I grew up, and it probably took me a lifetime to realise that. So, like many people, I've seen stories from the south and of places with names like Knepp and Norfolk, which I've rarely been to or seen, but I'm conscious that there's a story to be told in the north. And today we've got 3 people who I think embody what I'd call the magnetic north, in the form of Lee Schofield, site manager at RSPB Haweswater and author of Wild Fell, Cain Scrimgeour, university wildlife media lecturer, filmmaker, and co-director of Wild Intrigue CIC, and Heather Devey, a leader of Cumbria Beaver Group, co-director of Wild Intrigue, blogger, creative filmmaker and educationalist, but really an ambassador for many forms of wildlife and a real key link between people and the wild lives around us. So for that reason alone, I'm pleased to be here tonight. We've got the north pretty well covered, from Tyneside down to Teesside, through the uplands over the Pennines into Cumbria, and me here as a reasonably quiet token Yorkshireman. What I'd like to do is just hand over in a minute with my first question for tonight, which is really to open with Lee Schofield, in that Lee's book, Wild Fell, opens in a particular way, which I think typifies the world of conservation. We really see Lee at the start of his book clinging on to crumbling rock faces, hanging by his fingertips, and that just made me think, isn't that where nature resides now? I'm going to hand over to Lee for a short reading from Wild Fell to open our evening. Thank you, Lee.
Thanks, Jamie. Evening, everyone. 3 straggly trees huddle on the fissured face of Harter Fell, high in the Lake District's eastern corner. From 30 feet below, I can tell that they are willows, but I need to get closer to work out which species. With plenty of well-rooted birch and rowan to cling to, scrambling up the first part of the flower-hung crag is easy enough. The upper section, a few more degrees to the vertical, is a different matter. A loss of footing now would result in a slide, a plummet, and a limb-breaking landing on the boulder scree below. Few people set foot up here, leaving botanical treasures undiscovered in steep gullies and on brittle ledges. Water running over the crumbly, calcium-rich rocks forms patches of fertile, rudimentary soil, great for flowers, not so great for climbing. Halfway up this slippery mess of a cliff, a solid-looking, foot-long triangle of rock comes off in my hand, shattering on the ground below. I retreat with my pulse racing. Working around the base of the crag, I find a gentler ascent via a narrowing, grassy corridor, hemmed in by rising cliffs. As usual, my progress is slow, distracted every few steps by the summer wildflowers. Stone bramble, alpine lady's mantle, Northern bedstraw, lesser meadow rue, and starry saxifrage enliven the rocks, the poetry in their names adding to the allure of their shapes and colours. The willows come back into view with just a narrow, sloping slab bridging the gap between us, which I inch across crab fashion. I feel as if I'm reaching hallowed ground. Growing beneath the unruly mesh of the willow's branches are the fleshy stems of roseroot, the smooth oval leaves of devil's bit scabious, sturdy heather and vivid bilberry, a fragrant feast for any herbivore. That these plants are still here tells me that none have been brave or hungry enough to make the crossing. The soil is light and fluffy, with the rich mossy smell of an ancient oak wood. Any boot marks I leave will be quickly colonised, the plants erasing the evidence of my visit. Their glossy green foliage tells me that these are tea-leaved willow, a species which grows in only a handful of places in the Lake District fells. No more than shoulder height, their squat and sprawling form keeps them stable on their wind-battered refuge. The promise of such rare and beautiful plants makes botanising in these crags intensely addictive. There's always one more ledge to investigate, one more unexplored gully with secrets to uncover. I've never made it back to the car anything less than hopelessly late.
Thanks very much for that reading tonight, Lee. That's opening Wildfell and our idea about the North. Not in any sense of overconfidence, brashness, or anything like that, but just the sheer harshness of it, the difficulty of it, the difficulty of the landscape, perhaps the difficulty of climate and aspect and altitude. But there's another difficulty that comes across brilliantly in this particular book, and it's not only found in the North, but it's always found in a local way. And what I'd like to speak a little bit about tonight is the people that we have to work with, and that they can vary, but ultimately we may class them as neighbours. But I think often we apply labels to the people we work with, and we lump them together as landowners or conservationists or farmers or whatever we may call them. I've heard new words being invented to try and circumvent this issue we have of what to call anybody. But I think ultimately grouping people isn't helping the conversation and isn't always helping the work that we try to put forward. Heather, I was thinking the work that you've done, maybe particularly within the beaver groups that you've worked with, that work probably calls upon you to work with every neighbour imaginable, both near and far. And I just wonder what you've kind of found has helped you to navigate the choppy waters of conservation in the North.
That's a good question. I suppose it's worth saying that I worked with the Cumbria Beaver Group up until 2021, and that was quite an exciting time, but obviously a bit of an unusual time for the rest of the whole world, really, because that's when COVID hit. And the whole point of that was to talk to as many people as possible about beavers and the restoration of beavers. And what was lovely, I think, about that is I had to take it online because that was the only medium that we could share information through, of course. And what was really nice about that was kind of the first time I really spoke to people in depth about beavers, and I had responses. And through that, I didn't know what groups, I suppose, they were from. I didn't know if they were landowners or anglers or the general public, if they lived next to the Lowther estate where the beavers were released. And I think it just puts you all on that level playing field when you don't have those pre-assumptions of what the group might say. But then saying that, the following work that I've done in consultations for beaver reintroductions through Wild Intrigue, such as with Wild Ennerdale and RSPB Scotland Loch Lomond, a lot of those groups have been pre-assigned. And with that, you kind of learn to recognise the questions that might come up. So with anglers, it's a beaver's going to create the dams, and can beavers leap over the dams? That's quite a regular one. With farmers, are they going to flood my land? So you can kind of prepare fully for those events in advance. And I think that the most important thing is, it sounds really cheesy, but being open with people, and key is being honest and listening to people, not necessarily just telling them what you think they want to hear. It's listening to them and then responding to them individually, and not just assigning labels onto them, as you say.
And certainly thinking you've mentioned education there. I know that's been a key part of your work, Cain, working in the North, both at the university and elsewhere, and in your work through Wild Intrigue. But I think education might be too formal a word, perhaps, for what you do. Could you explain to us a little bit, perhaps, whether you might like to use a real life story as an example of how you've managed to create that connection between people and nature for a positive outcome?
Yeah, so at Wild Intrigue, we try and do things a bit differently and get new audiences out into nature, essentially. Because we started and we did expeditions and we attracted naturalists and people who wanted to be naturalists or ecologists, and we sort of felt that that was great, but we wanted to attract people who didn't necessarily come out. So instead of going to the cinema, they might come and spend a night with us on a bats and pizza night or a kitty-wake and donut walk. And thankfully, it's really worked and we're getting new audiences out. But on our kitty-wakes and donuts, I think it's fascinating that people come from Newcastle, they live in Newcastle, they commute over the Tyne Bridge every day, they see the kitty-wakes every day, but they've never given them a second glance. And that's not because they're disinterested, it's not because they've got no love of the kitty-wakes, it's just because they're going about their daily lives. But as soon as you open that door and tell them about ecology, you show them kitty-wakes up front, you tell them that they spend the winters at sea, you can see the spark just tick. And from that moment on, you know you've got a convert, and every time they cross the bridge, they're going to tell somebody else in the car when they're commuting, or they're going to tell somebody else on the sidewalk when they're walking. And I think that's all it takes, is that tiny little spark of realization that there's wildlife there, especially in the urban places, and that it is fascinating.
It's a really interesting point for me, because I think, Lee, where you work, it's one of the more remote places in Cumbria, although it's not necessarily far from the motorway or far from a major town. It is rather remote and rather a community unto itself, perhaps. So I guess that what you've done with writing Wild Fell and then talking about the book, perhaps that's served an avenue for you to communicate with a different audience. But how has that experience been for you?
It's a funny thing that you spend a whole load of time in your head looking at a screen, typing words out, and it feels like a very kind of private, quite solitary thing. But once the book is out in the world, I found it a really amazingly sort of connecting experience. It's reached people that I never would have met, and people have got in touch to ask me questions about it or whatever, and it really feels like it's helped to spread what I think are really important messages in the book, but also to kind of build those relationships and to build to forge alliances with people, if you like. I mean, this is one of the themes in the book, as well as something that's happened as a result of the book, is that when you work in conservation in a place like the Lake District, which is quite often seen as the sort of the domain of the farmers, if you like, and most of the landscape in the country, of course, is farmed, and most of the Lake District is farmed. The fact that it's a national park doesn't change that fact. And to start with, at Haweswater, I felt like we were very kind of isolated. I felt personally quite isolated. It felt like we were not necessarily very welcome in this world of farmers. And it was through kind of sticking around for long enough and reaching out to people and forging alliances and recognizing that there were actually lots of other people who perhaps also felt a little bit isolated, and just working with others to find forums for us to get together and spend time with each other and learn from each other, that it made the whole thing that much more enjoyable, for one thing. Expanding the team at Haweswater as well. So I was lucky enough to get to work with Heather for a few years. She was with us at Haweswater, and Heather and Cain are still involved with their hides at Haweswater. And the team is rapidly expanding. So we're forming all those kind of community links. And I think that gives us a sort of a confidence and a sort of sense of belonging that we perhaps didn't really have before. And that helps us to be probably more at ease in our own skin, so that when we're talking to people, we don't feel that we're necessarily having to prove something all the time. As you said, it all comes back down to people and relationships, and without those, then none of us are going to be making any progress at all.
That's a really interesting point, because I think perhaps the wrong idea for most organisations or people was to do with either the person or the message. That has to be the thing, and perhaps it's actually the perseverance and the persistence and the hanging on and hanging in there that's paying off, because I think all three of you have spent a long time on what is your extended patches, I guess, right across the north, all the way along Hadrian's Wall, essentially east to west coast, and down into Newcastle Tyneside and beyond, into the borders and into Cumbria. So I guess sticking around, perhaps within that time that you've spent, I'm just going to come back to Heather and Cain. I'm just wondering where you found your easiest win for wilding in the north. What was the... This is not me trying to be optimistic, but I'm betting there was something like Cain said. It didn't take long to connect people to Kittiwakes. But what's been your easiest win? And perhaps conversely, what's been your hardest, perhaps yet to be resolved battle? Cain and Heather, what could you tell us about that, please?
I think it's the easy win part's really interesting, because easy wins are sort of everywhere. And with the general public, it's not difficult to get somebody really engaged in nature, from opening the eyes to any little bits like Lee's beautiful book does. That you just need people to stop for that moment to engage. So people are generally easy wins, I think. The difficulty comes, like you say, with working with other organizations or partners or bigger businesses. And I think that's where the difficult wins are really on there.
Yeah, I think the difficulty comes when decisions are made on behalf of communities without prior actual consultation with communities, and then you've lost without even realizing what you already had, what you'd already won. There's a particular example that's going on in Scarborough at the moment with that, and I think that's really hard. So that can make you feel like all of those little wins somehow mean less. It can be quite depressing, in all honesty, if all of these decisions are made without consultation with people. I don't know, I think it can be quite saddening.
Yeah, definitely. We do a lot of work in Newcastle City Centre in a lovely little bit called the Oosburn, and it's this sort of post-industrial. It's got loads of old industrial buildings, but it's now full of creatives and artists and food places, but it still has a lot of green space left. But because it's this lovely place to live, the developers obviously hounding for the ground, and we're sort of stepping in there trying to say, look at what wildlife we got here, look at this fascinating wildlife. And you read the ecological reports from the buildings, and they are a lot of brownfield sites and industrial buildings, but you see that it's obviously only the rarer species get that, stopping the bats and the newts. But you're thinking about that, in the valley there might be 3 pairs of greenfinch, and 2 of your sites are going to be developed, which means that the greenfinch might become extinct within that valley. And to think of all them people who are living there who don't get the opportunity to hear a greenfinch sing is mental. And it's mainly because people haven't seen that the greenfinches are there now. So there's not enough fight to stop these developments or to get them to develop properly rather than putting tower blocks in.
Well, that's what crossed my mind for you, Lee, as well. That I'm hoping that I know the story of Wildfell entails some gargantuan struggles with all kinds of from the elements through to organisations, really. But have there been any quick, easy wins for you working on wilding through Wildfell at Wild Haweswater?
I don't know. There's been much that's been easy, but some of the most satisfying things have been things that have happened really quickly. So the river restoration work that we did, where we put the meanders back into a long stretch of the Swindale Beck, which had been sort of straightened a couple of centuries beforehand. As soon as the bends were back in and the gravel was being organised in a kind of more chaotic, complex way, and not simply being swept down the valley and sort of into people's homes downstream, salmon were back spawning in that watercourse. Within 3 months of the diggers leaving the site, salmon were back spawning. And I think, to see nature responding that quickly to something as simple as putting, the bends back into a river was really remarkable, and just shows nature's huge capacity to recover if we give her the chance to do so. I think quite often in conservation, you get used to having to wait a really long time. You plant a new woodland and it takes couple of centuries before it starts to feel like an ecologically functional, healthy woodland. Bog restoration, meadow restoration, they all take several years. When you add water to a landscape, when you add water to a habitat, the wildlife just seems to come as if by magic, almost instantly. For anybody who's had the joy of creating a pond in their garden, even, the speed at which the pond skaters and the dragonflies and the water boatmen and things seem to find it is just amazing. So yeah, that's some of the most satisfying projects I've been involved with, the ones that involve water, and just seeing how quickly that response can occur.
I can second that. A neighbour of mine, James Robinson from the Nature Friendly Farming Network, worked with Ullswater CIC to put ponds into a wet area of the farm, and they saw dragonfly ovipositing, laying eggs, I think within a couple of days of the work commencing. And certainly on a small scale, a garden pond here, we've had dragonflies hatch in front of our eyes, whose life cycle would suggest they go right back to almost the day the pond went in, because they have a 2-year life cycle to get to that stage. So unless they came in on a couple of plants that were donated, that's a heck of a quick turnaround for something that just wasn't there before. So yeah, I see what you mean about not necessarily easy, but satisfying and quick. What crossed my mind was, Lee, if there was something that should have been easier but hasn't been easier, and perhaps it's been made worse. Heather and Kate have mentioned perhaps the clumsiness sometimes of organisations or people that we have to work alongside. Is there anything that's still sort of is there 100 years war equivalent of wilding in the north that we're going to be fighting for forever and ever? What do you think?
I think we've got a real problem with our national parks, and I think the Lake District has its own particular problems, which make it really quite a difficult organisation to work with. A lot of it is down to a lack of funding. They don't have the capacity to employ staff to focus specifically on kind of nature and ecology. They are very bureaucratic, but I think that those things go for most national parks. I think there's this perception that national parks are places that nature is protected, where nature is doing better. Actually, the statistics show that not to be the case. Triple SIs on average are in a worse condition inside national parks than they are outside. That's not the perfect measure of biodiversity, but we don't have actually very many good metrics of biodiversity, and that's a problem in itself. But it is fair to say that national parks are not giving the protection to nature that I think most of the population would really like. And the Lake District has its own additional challenge in that it became a World Heritage Site in 2017. And although the World Heritage Site designation doesn't have kind of hard and fast rules about what must be done and what mustn't be done, and actually the only punitive measure that UNESCO, who are the body that sort of oversee World Heritage Sites, have, is to take the designation away again. But it still provides this additional layer of bureaucracy that you have to work through. So to do virtually anything, you have to do a heritage impact assessment. So if we'd carried out our river restoration project in Swindale a year after we did it in 2016, and the World Heritage Site came in the year after, we would have had to have completed a World Heritage impact assessment to justify why we felt restoring the ecological function of a river was worthwhile impacting on the cultural value of that river that had been straightened. And so, the logic of straightening that river, it was an important intervention. It was people living in a remote, difficult place to live in order to protect their hay meadows from flooding. So it kind of, that it was in their interest to get the water away from the valley as quickly as possible. But to say that should be maintained because of its cultural value is just clearly madness. It's nonsense. The cultural heritage, as I see it, should be about a kind of continuing, evolving relationship between people and the landscape. And the logic behind straightening the river was, how can we modify the land to provide the needs of society? And the needs of society at that time that those people were thinking about was their own kind of survival, effectively. Like, how can we keep our livestock alive through the winter? By putting the bends back into the river, we're carrying out exactly the same thought process. How can we make the land work better for society? But society's needs now are the desperate need to lock up more carbon, to make the landscape more resilient to flood risk, which is obviously escalating, to improve the quality of water, and to provide more homes for wildlife. So although the action was completely the opposite of what had been done a couple of hundred years earlier, the thought process was effectively the same, but we were just thinking about sort of societal needs in a slightly bigger sense. And yeah, the World Heritage designation just doesn't really seem to sort of accept that. It sort of seems much more to say sheep farming is important, we must preserve it. All this stuff that happened in the past, we must make sure it continues to be visible. And it's like, well, that's, you know, that isn't really sustainable, for one thing. And if it doesn't provide for people's livelihoods and helps, if it doesn't help them to continue to sustain that ongoing relationship with the land, then it strikes me as a bit wrong-headed.
Could I ask you, you've touched on one of my favourite parts of the book, Lee, and I just double-checked, page 112. This is something that I think you explain in a brilliant way to people who, I would think, the overwhelming majority of visitors and locals driving past, you know, the great banners and signs heralding various status of and you know, area of this or national of that, kind of important sounding monikers that we attach to landscapes. I think you touch on it brilliantly on page 112, and I wondered if you might just read that for people tonight, please.
Thanks, will do. The Lake District, with its constantly evolving farms and an ecosystem full of holes, became a World Heritage Site in 2017. The nomination document that describes the English Lake District World Heritage Site runs to 716 pages, so it's difficult to summarise what the designation really stands for. It talks a lot about beauty, about farming and sheep, especially Herdwick sheep, the Lake District's native breed beloved of Beatrix Potter. It mentions nature now and again, and talks about the Lake District as the birthplace of the conservation movement, though it means landscape conservation, which focuses on preserving the aesthetics of a place, rather than nature conservation, which is more concerned with the protection of species and habitats. It celebrates the area's geology and pretty lakeshore villas, its poets and farmers. If you look hard enough, you can find sections that support or oppose almost every possible point of view. But the emphasis on sheep farming is clear. The word sheep appears 365 times, the word flower only 3 times. Farm appears 1,052 times, nature 92 times. I'm sure that there are lots of people who care passionately about the designation, but I've not met many of them. Most of the farmers I know are ambivalent. Contrary to what you might expect, World Heritage status doesn't provide them with either funds or protection. The Federation of Cumbria Commoners initially welcomed the designation, having described it as a powerful weapon that puts hill farming centre stage. But it's not clear how that weapon is to be used. A couple of years after the inscription, a delegation from the Lake District's World Heritage Site steering group came to Naddle Farm to give my RSPB colleagues and me a training session designed to help us understand what being in a World Heritage Site meant for our conservation work at Haweswater and elsewhere in the lakes. I think Heather was in this meeting that I'm writing about, actually. You weren't. Can't verify it.
I've been very angry if I was.
Yeah, pretty good. They talked us through the cultural concepts from the nomination document and the new paperwork we now had to complete to enable the steering group to ensure our activities didn't impact on the World Heritage Site's attributes. In the discussion afterwards, I asked how the RSPB's presence at Haweswater was perceived from a World Heritage perspective. I was told that when the application was being prepared for UNESCO, the steering group had been forced to accept that there were a number of warts on the face of the potential World Heritage Site. And one of these warts was the RSPB's presence at Haweswater. For my and my colleagues' work to have been described like this was extraordinarily offensive, and the fact that anybody would be prepared to say something so blunt to our faces took my breath away. I asked for clarification, just to make sure I'd heard correctly. It was explained to us that we weren't authentic. Because we didn't fit the stereotypical profile of family farmers, we were considered second-class citizens. They were effectively saying that the only true stewards of the land in this newly minted World Heritage Site were the Lake District farmers, ideally born and bred here and from farming families, lineages to which my colleagues and I didn't belong. Yet they also worried about the lack of new entrants to farming. It's hard to see how this sort of thinking can end well.
Thanks very much for that, Lee.
You'd have nutted somebody, wouldn't you, Heather, if you were in the room?
100%.
Can I just add to that, Jamie?
Yes, of course, please.
we largely, a lot of our people, our guests come out from urban areas, but we do stuff in the national parks in around Kielden and Cumbria. And every year we get a good percentage of people asking where the wolves are or where the bears are, or sometimes even where the lynx are. And it's like truly magical thinking that people still think of our countryside with wolves and bears, and it's a hard thing to sort of bring them back to say that we don't quite have that, because you want that magic sort of kept in that environment, don't you? But then the reality is that we don't have them things, and it creates this dangerous perception that, like Lee was saying in his reading there, that we've got all this stuff in the countryside, so we don't sort of need to worry about it in our urban environments. And it's crossing over like that, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I wish sometimes I didn't have an ecological brain and that I just thought there was wolves and things still in Kielder Forest. I think that'd be a much nicer world to live in.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? I know we mentioned just before we started the session, I think, and where you are at the moment, you were saying there's a symbol for the area that you've been visiting, which is actually the beaver. And yet when we think about the symbols that are used, perhaps for national parks across the country, the ones that come to mind for me, some of them are incredibly problematic. Because in one instance, one's actually a religious symbol, which I find kind of interesting, because where's the inclusion there? Some of them are abstracts and sort of victims of modern day appetites for PowerPoint and so on, and cheap graphic design. And then some are species, and they may be wild species, the curlew and so on. They may be farm species, Swaledale sheep comes to mind, and others. So we've got this very interesting span over what a national park identifies as, I think, in this country. One of the things, thinking along those lines, how people latch on to the things they think are there or should be there or are part of the landscape. I'm particularly interested in this idea of the right animal in the right place at the right time, because I think that extends beyond just the wild side of life, and it does now extend into the crisscross over into the world of farming and husbandry, animal management, and so on. So I'm just thinking about, for the moment at least, what's been going on at Wild Haweswater Lee, but I see it duplicated elsewhere down in the Yorkshire Dales and beyond, that there seems to have been a switch from certain animals to other animals in what we would still see as the farmed landscape. And I wondered if you might talk to us a little bit about what you've done along the lines of farming, actually, but farming for nature as opposed to farming against nature. In that context, you were saying how people have had to fight the river in the past or prioritize other things. How have you farmed for nature, and what kind of animals have you found have helped you in that respect?
So I think it's probably worth just reminding people just how much more simple farming in the uplands of the UK and Lake District included has become in relatively recent times. So 100 years ago or so and back, most of the farms in the lakes would have had, as well as sheep, they would have had cattle, they would have had ponies for largely for working, and they would have had little arable fields where they'd be growing oats to feed them on. Most would have probably had some pigs, chickens, geese were pretty common. There's lots of goose garths and things marked on the maps. Goats were relatively common. We've got a Kidsney Pike at Haweswater, which is named for goats. Most places would have been growing apples and damsons and little orchards, kitchen gardens, root vegetables. Because if you're living in a challenging remote place where you can't just nip down the road to the shops, you're going to try to be as self-sufficient as you possibly can. But all of that diversity really kind of fell away after the Second World War, and the sort of the drive for food production at all costs led to a real simplification of farming, and the headage payments which were paid out to farmers per head of livestock meant that many farmers just focused on sheep and nothing else, because it's a lot easier to kind of increase your numbers of sheep quite quickly, because you can get 2 or maybe even 3 lambs out of them, and so you can swell your flock very, very, very quickly. And that's the economically rational thing to do, right? If you're a farmer and you're being offered money to have a large number of sheep, then you're going to increase your numbers of sheep as much as you possibly can. And so it's that monocultures of any type are problematic. Be it an arable crop be it sort of monocultures of bracken or Molinia in sort of more natural upland landscapes. And sheep are just as much of a problem. If you have just the same kind of grazing going all the time, then it's going to be problematic. So, what we're trying to do at Haweswater, and what lots of other kind of conservation grazing projects are doing, are moving back in one way to a more kind of traditional mixed system, where they're bringing in cattle and ponies and perhaps pigs to provide some disturbance. But the reason to do that is not necessarily to recreate some kind of past farmed landscape, but it's mainly because actually that is closer to a sort of a wild grazing regime that we might have had once upon a time, way back when. If you have cattle, pigs, ponies, and deer, those are effectively our 4 wild herbivore species, the ancestors of. Sheep are not a native species to the UK. They came over here sort of 6,000 years ago or so. And so their impact on our native flora and fauna is very much more significant and very much more damaging, especially if the numbers are very high, than those other species that I mentioned. And one of the reasons for that is that they just graze very differently. So they have very small mouths, so they can kind of pick out all the sweet things from the sward, and they tend to leave behind the coarse, unpalatable things, and they, of course, end up sort of dominating. Cattle and ponies being so much larger, they kind of create little niches in the soil. They tend to just rip at the vegetation and take whatever's there. And so, they're not anything like as selective. And so you end up with a kind of more diverse sward as a result. So by mixing up those grazing animals and also changing the way that they're managed and giving them sort of short bursts of grazing in a particular place and then long periods of rest, you can in some ways kind of emulate that sort of wild grazing regime. And that's what we're sort of busily trying to do at Haweswater, and trying to be as kind of random as possible, which is actually quite difficult to do, particularly in a farm landscape. Often if you've got a small farm, you haven't really got that flexibility. We're very fortunate at Haweswater, and we've got quite a lot of space to play with. And yeah, sometimes we'll get it right, and sometimes we'll maybe go too hard or too light. But we can do something differently the next year, and that's what nature really wants. It wants dynamism and chaos and randomness. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks very much for that. Amy has received a question that I think she'd like to share with us, if that's okay, Amy. Please go ahead.
Yes. Hi, good evening, everybody. I am listening in the background, and we've had a lovely comment from Sharon Lashley of Climate Action North, who is a big fan of Heather and Cain's. He's with you to bring the Moths and Muffins events. I love the way you theme your events. Food, how brilliant. Kitty-wakes and donuts, and what was it with pizzas? Was it bats and pizzas?
Bats and pizza.
Yeah. Marvellous. It's just a win-win. But she said it's really worked with people as an approach, and that you're particularly good at engaging with businesses that their organisation is linked with. So I'm just wondering, as much for Lee as well, really, how you see the role of local businesses in generating the community that you've all spoken about, because that's something we don't often talk about. We talk about engaging with farmers and we talk about engaging with the public, but actually, engaging with businesses seems like quite a powerful thing. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
So hello, Sharon. I suppose where we are now, we should say we're in the Netherlands at the moment, aren't we? We're in probably not saying this right, Biesbosch National Park, and it's so exciting to be here because it's a national park, and they've chosen the beaver as the icon for the park. There's a long story behind it, but it's this huge wetland system, isn't it? It's really complex and wonderful, and the national park have really bought into it. So everywhere you go, there are beaver signs, there's beaver merchandise wherever you look, there are beaver biscuits on every corner. I've had quite a few, and there are beaver pubs as well. So I think getting businesses to tie into this kind of pride in nature has worked really well here. And it's something that we don't always do very well at, I think, in Britain, in linking all of these things together and making people really feel that pride and not feel quite so nervous about that pride, and not feeling like you have to continuously mitigate people's emotions, to be completely honest, and their beliefs, and just having that sincere pride in the special things that you have here, the beavers. And it's vital to integrate business into that, really, because they're the people who are creating an income to the local area. We try and develop nature-based economies with different businesses like Proven Goods Co. in Newcastle, who do organic, sustainable, local source donuts, and First and Last Brewery in Northumberland, to try and show that, if you've got all of this forage for the beer, then you've got all of this forage with the insects for bats. So we try and connect these things together, don't we?
Yeah, and it works both ways as well, because on our Kittiwakes and Donuts, people will often have a donut and they'll think, like, that is amazing donut, I want to go and buy that donut. Or we'll also get people who don't want to stand in the massive queue for Proven Donuts, and they'll come and learn about Kittiwakes because it's easier to get a donut that way. So it's that complete cycle around and that's exactly what what the rest of business and the world sort of goes for, doesn't it? That's like, and I think, in conservation world and tourism, that we need to get better at doing things like that.
Mm.
I can think of the crossover there, I guess, Lee, is that partly what's happening at Haweswater is in partnership with a huge corporate organisation, of course, isn't it? So I guess that's brought. I mean, could you explain in a nutshell how that came about and how RSPB made a case for nature, talking to a big corporate organisation?
I'm not very good at doing things in nutshells, am I? I ramble a bit. So United Utilities are a huge landowner. They own 9% of the Lake District National Park and lots of land outside of it as well. And they draw water from something like 30% of the national parks area. So they're a huge player in our part of the world. And until around sort of 20 years ago or so, they just didn't really think about their land and its the nature-based solution that it could offer them. They had farm tenants. They farmed it directly themselves and quite intensively at the time. And so it was working with United Utilities over decades. RSPB have been at Haweswater since 1969, and our interest initially was around golden eagles and protecting the golden eagle nest that was at Haweswater for that period. But we were always kind of working, strengthening the relationship with United Utilities, in the aim of having a more kind of serious land management operation. I found out today, actually, that apparently we pitched for the tenancies that we have at the moment, like 15 years before 25 years ago. If only we'd got them then, we would be much further ahead than we are now. But anyway, yes, and so we started working on a single farm on the northern part of the Haweswater catchment to basically kind of experiment with ways that you could change the land to improve the quality of the water. So things very simple, low-tech solutions like fencing out watercourses, creating kind of woody buffer strips along them, reducing the intensity of the grazing, putting stock inside during the winter months to allow natural vegetation to recover, all that kind of stuff, blocking up drains. And all of that just helps the catchment to work as a much better filter. And so the land that's flowing over and through it ends up in a cleaner condition than it would be if those changes hadn't happened. And so that sort of single farm trial was scaled up into a really major program where United Utilities were spending millions of pounds on restoring the health of their catchment. And that was basically out of their own self-interest. It was about a pretty low cost solution to trying to slow the declining trend in the water quality. And it's been shown to be really effective. And it's something that all water companies are now doing to a greater or lesser extent. Catchment management is sort of the bread and butter for most water companies, and it was really United Utilities and RSPB working together that pioneered that approach. So yeah, I think that's I think when you're working with businesses, we have to remember that it's self-interest that drives businesses, right? But we can offer a whole range of benefits to businesses as a nature conservation sector. Flood risk is a huge concern. Any business in Carlisle, not every single one, but lots of them are really at risk of flooding. So if we can connect those people who will benefit from a kind of land management that reduces the flood risk with those, so yeah, connecting the kind of the service providers and the beneficiaries and trying to get exchanges in finance, and that's happening increasingly all over the place. So I think, yeah, the world is waking up to this kind of stuff, and that we need to work together much more effectively across lots of different sectors.
Thanks for that, Lee. I'm thinking now into the urban setting, Cain and Heather, that you often work in. I guess the threats of change of land use on the rural sort of sector is the thing that we're watching on that side of the board. But in the urban, I guess it's much, and particularly on the brownfield sites, I suspect the key threat's going to be developments, building developments in particular. So I'm just curious there, if you've explored those avenues and what you've found there, and where you may have been able to inform things, or where you see a chance to actually help with the urban side of wilding in the north.
Yeah, well, we went, you mentioned Knepp at the start, we went down there just last May, wasn't it? And it's a spectacular place, and hearing the nightingales sing through it. We went in May, so the dawn chorus was unbelievable. But when we were stomping around, other than the sheer scale of it and them star species, it was like coming home a bit, because it was the same as the abandoned allotments behind my house when I grew up, or the bit by the side of the metro that they left into scrub. And take away the large herbivore sort of management, it's pretty much the same sort of habitats, only in fragments, isn't it? And it's them areas where the drug dens as kids when you're growing up, when there were people in there was burnt out cars, or there's fridges piled up, or the earmarked for development and fly tipping and the mattresses and all sorts of these things. But essentially it's the same sort of habitat as what is Knepp. But Knepp's heralded as this amazing success.
Which it is.
Yes. Well, these sites are earmarked for either sort of ASBOs or for development, and it's just, my mind boggles as why these two things are different. And often the time is because we've found that people don't realize what's in these areas and what wildlife's persisting in there. So we in Newcastle, we had a spot, and I got wind that they were going to remove this big bramble patch. Well, it wasn't so big; it's only a little bit, but it was a dense area of bramble. And I sort of went, we'll go along, and they agreed to meet up. Managed by lovely volunteers that preserved this green space for years. And when we turned up, I didn't have to open my mouth once, because as we stood there, long-tailed tits were nest building, they were carrying feathers in. And we didn't need to say anything. They immediately saw the benefit of that and saw that long-tailed tits went, but they just didn't know they were there. And I think often that's the case in these sort of urban, messy, scrubby, sometimes scary areas.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's I think when you grow up in an urban, slightly rough place, you're kind of used to pottering around these places. But these developers that come, they're generally not from such places, I have found. So yeah, they see these brownfield sites as being less of a habitat. There's no financial value in them as they are. There's no worth in them. So we're trying to kind of show people that there is worth. It's it's a different kind of worth. It's the song birds that you hear when you're walking through on your way to work. It's the smell of the bramble when you're taking your kids to school, and all of this. It's the intrigue and the enchantment that's there. So we actually tried to integrate what we found from Knepp. They've got those lovely rounded bramble because of the incredible grazing regime that they've got there. We tried to bring some of that to this kind of corner of Newcastle, and it was a great way to engage with the environment group there, wasn't it, to show that other people might see this as a bit scruffy. We've got the litter in there, there's all sorts going on, but we can bring a bit of wild, and we can keep it tidy how they want at the same time. It's just all about talking to each other and bringing expertise from these incredible wild sites that exist back to the city, I think. Yeah,
the volunteers really enjoyed trying to get into the mind of being a cow or a pony or something like that for the day to manage these patches of bramble.
It's good fun.
But we do these dawn chorus disco walks. So like a dawn chorus disco, parabolic microphone and silent disco gear. And the walk route we take them on, the first section's just been, it starts on the River Tyne, so you've got birdsong from the riparian edges that are still in existence. But then you go through sort of a recently developed area, which is sort of now grey. There's a few pockets of green here and there. So we might get a wren or a goldfinch singing. And then we go into this concrete bridge archway, and somebody described it as the gates of Narnia. Because as you go through, there's still loads of green areas, and there's songthrushes singing and blackbirds singing. But the developments that are coming up are pushing that. So there will no longer be Narnia gates, and nobody will ever be able to experience that again, because it keeps pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And all these tiny pockets that are irrelevant to the developers are really, really key in terms of the wildlife in that area.
Mm.
It's a fascinating thought, Ken, because I think thrushes in particular look for an amphitheatre to perform in, don't they? A natural amphitheatre. And I've heard them singing most loudly in housing estates, often on the solitary tree that's in a horseshoe of housing. And it provides such an incredible acoustic for that repeated phrasing of a song thrush. And you just think that's probably the best song thrush I've ever heard, has been in that kind of setting, in a residential setting, often in social housing settings. But it's limited. It's limited by the amenity grassland and the single tree that's been permitted in the no ball games area. And it's that kind of, wow, there's something there that could be so much more. That's for certain. One of the things I was thinking about is we've touched on a little bit of the work to restore nature that's going on in Wild Haweswater, but not just the restoration. Some of the jump start to that might involve reintroductions, and beavers have certainly been mentioned. But I wonder, in both contexts, both the uplands and the urban, what future you might see, all of you really, this question is addressed to, for future reintroductions. What do you see down the line? Certainly, let's say within our lifetimes. What do you see, Lee? Or what would you like to see?
Well, what I'd like to see and what I think we might see are probably two different things. There's loads of plans. There's lots of things happening. Water voles, marsh fritillary butterflies, pine martins. There's lots of discussion about pine martin translocation into the lakes at the moment, which would be a reinforcement because they're kind of already here, but in very, very low numbers. And then we're also likely to feel the benefit of reintroductions that are happening elsewhere, and that are, where populations are expanding. Red kites moving back into lots of different places across the country. We're very hopeful that maybe we might see golden eagles back at Haweswater one day, and if we do, that's likely to largely be thanks to the translocation project in southern Scotland. So there's 33 birds, I think, circulating around the Scottish borders at the moment, as a result of sort of 5 years of releases that they've been doing up there. And a couple of those paid us a visit at Haweswater quite recently, actually, a few months ago. 2 birds that were satellite tagged came to Haweswater, flew around for a bit, and then went back to Scotland again. So we like to think that they were kind of scoping the place out for the future, perhaps. Likewise, white-tailed eagles, they've been kind of coming through from time to time. So sometimes it can be hard to stay optimistic, I think, but there are some really fantastic projects that are being really very successful at bringing some of these species back from the dead. And so I think it's good to remember those and keep ourselves topped up with a degree of optimism.
I think that's the nicest image I can think of, Lee, there, of golden eagles coming down to Wild Haweswater and seeing it as an up-and-coming area. They may pop back in the future because they've got a nice long lifespan. They can be choosy, can't they? So thinking also for Heather and Cain, what we've heard about some of the things that you've saved and you've highlighted and that you've drawn people's attention to. But when I think about mainland Europe, some of the things that have re-arrived or returned to these areas, now they're very urbanised. We hear great stories about things going on in Berlin with goshawks and wild boar and goodness knows what. But what do you think might be in the future there in those brownfield and those urban areas that you've for part of your time specialised in?
Beavers. Beavers everywhere. Seriously though, I really do think that we need to push on now, or at least Natural England need to push on now and pursue these free living beaver reintroduction licenses, because currently you can only apply for the enclosed releases, which is it's been brilliant and it's been a vital part of restoring the species, but it's creating additional barriers in the landscape. And I think it's about time that we see the catchment scale benefits that they can bring back. And then with that, you've got all of this incredible heterogenic, dynamic wetland recreation, and you get the water voles back, you get your otters back, you might in the future get your storks back. It's, you know, with beavers, they're kind of the totem for more reintroductions and more natural recolonization as well of wetlands. So beavers for me.
I keep telling my students at Carlisle that within the maybe next 10 years, they'll be able to walk out the doors at the Brampton Road campus and they'll be able to go down the River Eden and there'll be some beavers down there for them to watch alongside the otters.
Well, do you know, Ken, I was thinking about that because I know you've done work on the campus, haven't you? Again, it's not a small-scale project. Universities own a great deal of green space as well. And that was something that you managed to introduce in your own inimitable, softly fashion. But you've had some real success there with the wildlife media students, haven't you? And could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so the campus is just on outside of Carlisle, and it's quite a lovely green space. It's got some old tree planting and different species, but it was largely, again, like most colleges or schools, it was a big field. And essentially what I did was I hammered a fence post in and land grabbed. So I land grabbed a bit of the field, and every sort of few weeks I'd move the post, and eventually the contractors just started cutting in front of the post. But it's been fascinating what's happened, because as Lee says, that takes years in the uplands to see any sort of winds, but just on that small bit, we've had so much winds. We've got a tree sparrow colony there now, so there's probably 20 pairs of tree sparrows. In the area of grass that's been left and not cut, I counted 45 spikes of northern marsh orchid, and there's common spotted orchid there that have just arrived from just not being cut. Roe deer on campus now, and all these different things that have just come from literally being left. We've planted a few hedgerows and a few trees, and we dug up the car park and planted a hay meadow. So the centre of the car park was dug up, and there's a hay meadow in now. So they were all very, very simple things, just asking the right people, maybe doing a little bit of cheeky stuff that you shouldn't necessarily be doing to land grab there, but it's all been winning. It's fascinating that it's not only benefit the students because they've got so much wildlife there to photograph now, but you get members of staff and they'll say they've seen this and they've seen that. And one of the estates team seen a shrew running through one of the areas of grass were left. And when I said, well, we'll have to cut that in the autumn so we can take the grass off, and he was distraught that he had to cut this wild edge that had supported this shrew. But it's amazing that if you do let it come back, then people do take notice and realise things are coming around.
I don't think we're going to get a better story than digging up a parking lot and creating paradise, Cain. That's absolutely beautiful, a little story from Carlisle there. What I would say as we approach the last couple of minutes is I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for persevering with New Networks for Nature and seeing us through to this session. Thank you very much to all our guests for attending from here and far. Lee Schofield, Heather Devey and Cain Scrimgeour, and to my fellow volunteer Amy Jane Beer. New Networks for Nature will be back this year with an event in Norwich, and there's lots of information on the website. I think tickets will be going on sale in the near future. Lineups are announced very, very shortly. The event will be 16th to the 18th of November. That's I think it's a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 16th to the 18th of November. And there will be a Northern Networks for Nature the year after that too, at a venue to be confirmed. So the meetings will still be going ahead. The online sessions are a new idea that we hope are going to be well supported. We're doing this to help people make contact with others and perhaps follow that through social media and through other informal gatherings of their own. We're all trying to do the right thing, aren't we? And we need each other to help with that, really. So thank you guys for helping us with that. As I say, from wild Haweswater and its prospecting eagles through to the conversion of the parking lot to paradise in Carlisle, and to beavers everywhere from Heather. That's been a terrific hour, everybody. So thank you very, very much for joining us. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, we have ended.